Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to CNE Online. So we're here today, this afternoon, for discussing the board's role, particularly as we're heading into this next phase of the crisis and thinking about how to reopen businesses, how to re-enter workplaces, and particularly what the board's role is going to be in that. Before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of logistical pieces. One is that during the presentations, I'll be taking questions through the chat function. So if you want to open up the chat function now, in your menu, it should say chat. And if you click on that, it'll pop open and you can type to everybody. And just if you want to say where you're located right now, if you want to say something about how you're feeling, what the weather's like, we're happy to hear that too. So we can see where you're all from and who all is here. So we have Cindy from Northern Virginia, Barbara from Charlottesville. That's fantastic. And if you haven't already done so, if you could change the name on your account to reflect your actual name, and if you wanted to add in your pronouns, preferred pronouns, that's a great place to do that. So you can do that by, if you open the participants window, which is the same place you found that chat window, that'll give you a list of who's in the room and you can see who else is here. And if you hover over your own name, there'll be a little blue box that opens up that should allow you to rename it, and you can change your name that way. So if you could throw a first and last name and an organization, that would be ideal, just so I can keep track of who else is here and so you all can see who else is in the room as well, because I imagine a lot of you actually know each other in real life, as they say. So for the presentation, I'll ask you to leave your microphones muted, and I'll take questions during that time with the chat function. And then towards the end of the presentation, we're gonna have folks stick around, and we're gonna sort of open up to a Q&A session and a discussion session. At that point, we'll ask people to unmute and sort of join in there. And if we have a huge number of folks, we can break up into smaller groups if need be. That's all I have, so I will hand things over to Cindy and Christine.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Christine Nardi. I'm the Executive Director of CNE, and I'm so glad to see your faces today. I'm joined by Cindy Colson. She and I are going to co-lead the webinar this afternoon. I want to echo Andrew's thanks for having you all join us today. If you are a board member, we appreciate you spending your valuable volunteer time exploring with us how to bring the most to your board service. Your work is always important, but especially critical in times of great challenge like these for us as a society, for our own organizations, and for the people and communities we serve. And if you're an executive or staff member, we want to thank you for valuing the role of the board, or seeing the board's potential enough to learn more about how it can be a unique asset during this recovery. So thanks everybody for joining us. We've got a couple goals for today for this hour. We want to give you a re-entry frame to consider for your board work. We want to talk about what the board specifically can bring to reopening and re-entry. The board is an asset. We want to highlight how to consider risk in this environment, since we're in a high-risk environment. And we want to recommend some specific areas of board focus. And if we succeed, you'll be able to identify for yourselves and for your board how to add more value as your nonprofit is tackling reopening and reentry. And we'll also be able to do some Q&A and some on-the-spot problem solving for any board challenges that you're having, or questions that you're wanting to discuss and debate with us and with other board members. So some of what we talk about today is unique to this moment, and some of it is a reminder of good, strong board practice that is needed always, but especially in a crisis. And I am going to turn it over to Cindy for starting with setting the framework.
Great, thank you, Christine. So Andrew, if you can just move, thank you. Those are our goals for today, and we've got setting the framework. And if you can move us one more slide, because I want to start off with this note, and I want to talk about your role right now is that you are leading your organization through a transition to something new. We don't know what that new is, but what we do definitively know is that you're transitioning your organization to something that did not exist in February of 2020. Whatever we are experiencing at this time, there are key elements that we know are going to get sustained, even once we make it into the rebuilding phase. There will be lessons learned that we want to incorporate into that. There are habits and patterns that we want to continue, but we need to be sure that you understand that your role is really leading the organization through that transition to something new with that. If you go to the next slide, we're looking at the community recovery framework. We pulled this from Strong Towns, which is actually a tool for local elected officials. At CNE, we recognize that the nonprofit sector is part of a bigger whole, and that whole includes our public, private sectors, and the nonprofit sector. So as we were looking at this tool, this truly resonated with us, and you'll see it has 3 different phases. We have the phase 1, which arguably people would say that we're already through, which was that immediate response. We saw huge upticks with some of our nonprofits that are dealing with basic needs, such as food and shelter, public health. You would argue those nonprofits that are managing open spaces also saw a huge uptick. They were making immediate pivots during that time. Today, we're going to be talking about that phase 2, but just to give a little bit of framework, that phase 3, which we're looking at rebuilding, is going to be a time where we're starting to see some stabilization. There's starting to be some consistencies in the environment. We're not there yet. The change is still continuing to happen really quickly. So we're still in that phase 2 of our work. And as it says there in that phase 2, that we're not going back to February 2020, as I said. The other thing that we're starting to see in that classical messy middle time is we're starting to see within our society some revealing of some of the deep dysfunction that we have. We're starting to see where there's fragility in some of our critical systems that we've depended on historically. With that, all of that is starting to come to realization at this point. So leadership is even more key at this phase 2 as it was in phase 1. We're needing to look to our leaders to be really innovative and to be sure that they're equipped to be making decisions on the ground and ready to create change. And Andrew, if you can slip through to just highlighting, there, slip one more for me. There we go. Just to get us all on the same page here, I want to be sure that when I'm talking about recovery and rebuilding, I want to be mindful that I'm not talking about restoration. Again, remember, we're not going back to February 2020. We are looking at what opportunities are ahead, not at what we've lost, but what it is that we're learning during this time and what we want to be carrying forward. You'll see I've highlighted here doubling down on community stability. Historically, in our communities, we have identified vitality in the concept of growth, more so than we have in terms of community stability and sustaining. If there's any time that we need to be mindful of that community stability, it's really now, especially in phase 2, not focusing on that growth phase. And then the third point here would be to strengthen our civic infrastructure. And here what we're talking about is there are many different entities, be it faith-based, nonprofit, government, who are trying to address some needs in our community, and we need to be strengthening those regardless of who's initiating those. We want to be supportive and allowing them to step into that space of being the experts, and we also want to be partnering with them in some really creative and innovative ways during this time. So that's the big picture in terms of the framework of what we're seeing that's trending and what's being termed this phase 2 that we see. And also we just note that that phase 2 can last anywhere between 3 to 12 months, yet to be determined time frame. But we do feel that we're squarely in that space. So I'm going to transition to Christine to talk more specifically about the board's role during this time of phase 2.
Thanks, Cindy. And I just want to pause and ask Andrew, have we gotten any questions yet that we can field?
No, I haven't seen any.
Okay, I'm going to keep going. So this slide shows you, and it shouldn't surprise you given that Cindy and I really do focus in on governance for organizations as part of our roles at CNE. And we consider the board to be an asset. It isn't always an asset. It depends on how your board is structured and how engaged it is, but we do a lot of work to help organizations make sure that their boards are assets for the organizations. And so if a board is high impact and if a board is engaged well, we think it can really be your special secret superpower for your organization. But to do that, let's go back to the basics and the next slide. We've got a couple things to highlight. One of the things that we always talk about in terms of the role of the board is to govern an organization, not manage an organization. As a general rule, there are kind of two different but complementary roles. And if you think about the role of the board as compared to the role of management or staff, one analogy you can consider is a bicycle built for two. So if you have a bicycle built for two, what helps the most is if you have two on the bike, pedaling in the same direction and really supporting each other to get from point A to point B. If you don't have two people on the bike, or if you have one that's not pedaling, then it makes it harder to actually do the job of getting from point A to point B. And so think about the role of the board and the role of management or staff as that bicycle built for two. And if both seats and both people on the bike are working well, then you're more efficient and more effective getting from point A to point B. The governance role in many cases is that role of taking the 360 view and really helping your organization look to the future, while the management role or the staff role, if you have staff, is to implement on the day-to-day. Now, obviously there's crossover between the two, but that's the big picture of how board governance works. So whether you're a board chair or a board member or an executive leader, now is a really good time to lean on your board and lean on it for its governance capabilities, but also understand that the roles could shift during a crisis, and you may well have seen them shift during the crisis. But in the governance context, your board should really be expected to provide leadership through these troubling times and really set an example for others. So examples of board leadership in this recovery time and could include the board really naming that they are going to continue their individual financial commitments, and if they're able to increase their financial commitments, and also to support you in raising funds in new and different ways. Another way that the board could show leadership is to really step up its role as an ambassador for the organization, representing the organization to funders both old and new, and really being able to articulate what the unique value is for the organization now in the crisis and into the recovery. And that would go for both funders and the public. And then also to actively participate in the organization. It's really an all hands on deck kind of moment. And Andrew, we're still at that prior slide, thanks. So for boards that have been disengaged, this can be an opportunity to bring your board to life, to improve communication. There's no time like the present and no time like a crisis to really look carefully at your board and think, how can we make it work best for the organization? I want to just note that I recognize that not all organizations have paid staff. So if you have an all or mostly volunteer organization with no or limited staff, board members often fill in gaps, and we call them working board members. It's important in any environment for you to name when a board is engaged in the management or the working of the organization, and when a board is engaged in the governance of an organization. But in this case, the second bullet says roles can shift upon landing. And when I wrote that, what I was thinking of was, when you're in an airplane and they say your contents can shift upon landing, what that means in the context of board service is if you have experts on your board, or if you need additional working capacity to flex to respond during the pandemic, it's going to be really important to continue to look to your board for support, either to provide that expertise or to help you source that expertise. And especially if they too are dealing with reopening issues in their own businesses or in their own environment, they are learning right alongside with you. So these your board members and you as individual board members can be special reopening advisors to the executive director and the staff, and also implementers in some cases. But just be clear that you're doing it as a volunteer staff for the organization and not necessarily in your governance role. So let's switch to the next slide. All right, so there are a couple of phase 2 priorities for you all as board members and for those staff members who are on the call who are thinking about how best to engage the board members. The first is to make sure that you're reviewing the current bylaws and policies that you already have and thinking about whether you need to change, alter, or discontinue them if needed, and also whether you need to give some more power and more support to your executive committee or say a COVID-19 board committee to really help make crisis decisions that need to be made quickly and need to be made importantly in order to provide the best services you can to a community and vulnerable community members that need them. So the importance of this is to really stay grounded in the decisions and the policies that you made before the heat of the crisis about how to operate, and be thoughtful about changing or updating those policies as you move forward. So for example, this may be a time when organizations need to look differently at their finances and may need to consider drawing on their lines of credit. And if that's the case, it'd be important to lay out the parameters, if you don't already have them, for when you do draw on your line of credit and when you make a schedule to pay that back. And then secondly, with reopening and reentry, we are walking deeper into the unknown. We all know that. There are bound to be false starts. There are bound to be new challenges and disruptions. So it's good to really ensure that you know as an organization and as a board who is going to speak for the nonprofit, and that you're prioritizing transparency in that communication, understanding that we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to bump along a bit, but how we adjust and communicate will determine the impact of those mistakes. And then thirdly, think about engaging yourself as a board member and the board as a whole a little bit differently. And let me stress that this does not have to be coordinated or perfectly planned. Nobody has this figured out. And in some senses, that's an opportunity. So here are a couple things that we've seen. There are some organizations that have put together board and staff COVID-19 task forces, and those meet weekly or every couple of weeks to stay up to date and to be able to make real-time strategy pivots. And there are boards that we are seeing that are meeting more regularly. They may have their monthly or bi-monthly board meetings, but they're getting together in between to really keep up to date and in sync on what's happening with the organization and what's happening in the environment, so they can help do troubleshooting on the ground and help figure out what those pivots should be, as well as really be focused on what are the mission-related activities that can and should continue. And so the reason for all of this is to ensure that the board can continue to be that special secret superpower. So in the context of reopening and reentry, it's going to be really important that you inform and engage and get the board involved in both thinking about the reopening and the reentry plan and figuring out how to execute it in a land, as we've all realized, of many, many unknowns. And then lastly, this question of risk. We have to face and embrace risk if we're going to come out stronger on the other side. And the next section of the presentation is where we're going to focus in on some risk questions. But I want to stop here to see if any questions have popped up in the chat.
There's nothing there now, but I invite folks to throw any questions they might have up there so we can take a look at them.
Okay, I'm going to dive into this topic of risk. And I hope by the end of these couple of slides, you'll realize why we've decided to prioritize and talk about this in the context of reopening and reentry. So Andrew, if you'll go to the next slide. The board really serves as the chief risk officer for the organization. And so we encourage you, as you're thinking about reopening and reentry, to consider these three questions on the slide as the chief risk officer for your organization. So if you look at questions 1 and 2, sometimes there's a sense in our world, and because board members and nonprofit staff and leaders are in our world, there's a sense that the choice is between taking risk and not taking risk, as though there's a risk-free alternative. That's rarely ever the case with organizations or in life, but particularly not now. And so that's why these questions are so important. There are two kinds of questions. The first question is the one that we most often ask ourselves as board members. And that is, how do we manage the potential liability of reopening and bringing people back into our particular facility? What are our safety measures going to be in reopening? That's preparing to address the risks that could be problems. The second, though, is equally and sometimes more important. And that is, are you preparing to take the risks that you need to make sure that you're providing the services that are needed right now with your organization in response to the impact of the crisis and the impact on the economy and the community for many months to come. And so if you're going to be radically responsive to community need, For example, finding new ways to get food to kids who are food insecure, finding new drop-off points, going to families, for example, or providing innovative, responsive, free online arts content. Those are pivots and those are innovations that only happen if you as an organization step into the responsibility of taking risks in order to best achieve your mission. So if we can go to the next slide, there's just a quick visual for you on this. It's really two sides of the same coin. Are you preparing to both address and take the risks as well as mitigate the risks that you see for your organization to be more impactful in your next generation of service? As a board, you have to consider how to protect the organization by minimizing operational risk and how to protect the mission by taking those risks. It's a both and, two sides of the same coin, and sometimes they may feel like they are in tension. But to learn and grow in assessing risk, you have to ask these questions now and really always. What are the risks that we're taking during this crisis? What are the risks that we're taking when we reopen and re-enter the economy? And are those risks, can we mitigate the risks to the operation, and can we take the risks needed to really provide the best support or services that the community is asking for? And so one interesting question that you might consider is, and in order to build this risk assessment muscle, is what are all the risks that our organization has been taking? And what of those risks perhaps have been ill-advised, or we might have looked differently if we'd known that there was going to be a pandemic? And that can help you start to have this conversation within the board that can prepare you for both looking at how do we take risks and how do we minimize risks. And then just the next slide and a last point about risk is there are lots of elements that combined impact how well a board and its members address the risks of governance. Some, for example, are the results of the varying levels of knowledge and experience and attention that boards bring to how they consider risk and what is warranted risk and what is appropriate for your organization. So this is where diversity of all kinds on boards, but especially now racial and equity diversity, income diversity, lived experience diversity is extremely powerful in assessing not only how do we mitigate risk, but how do we take risks to best meet the demands of the community and to best live into our mission. And some result in factors that don't really seem on point on their face, but impact the quality of the debate or the analysis that you have within a board conversation. And those are group and interpersonal dynamics. So if you don't have a healthy, trusting, productive board relationships, both individually and collectively, now is the time to build them, because all of this affects organizational effectiveness overall. And it's not abstract, it's really how do you build organizational and board resilience in crisis to strengthen the organization coming out of it. And there's no time like the present. So next slide. I want to dive just a little bit deeper into how we take risk and really talking about the difference between risk management and risk leadership. So here's the question really. Are you taking the appropriate level of risk for your constituents and stakeholders, the risk they deserve, while engaging in your fiduciary duty of care? And examples of where we as organizations and boards may not take the risks the mission and the commission and the community deserve are if boards are slow to take programming risks to pivot, if they perceive the risk of doing that and being slow to be a risk that's acceptable to take, then the risk of preserving the organization and preserving the organizational infrastructure. And so the importance is to say, are these risks that we're taking in pivoting our services, are they as valuable or more valuable than the risks we're incurring in doing that? And another example, a long-term example, would be if boards are slow to actively manage succession planning for their board and staff to maintain continuity and program impact. So we focus on risk at all levels of our work. First is the most obvious. As board members, we have a duty to ensure that we have assets and resources that are being stewarded and deployed in the most effective way for the organization. And what does that look like now? That looks like, do we have the right cleaning protocol to keep our staff and clients safe when we reopen? And what are our guidelines, for example, for taking on debt? That's your fiduciary risk. The second type of risk is this strategic risk. We ask ourselves as board members how we best proceed in the direction we think is most important to achieve our mission. And right now, the questions we are asking ourselves as board members is the strategy that we have and how we've been executing it still relevant? And if we're a frontline nonprofit, how long will we experience increased need of food and shelter, for example, and what resources do we need to adapt? So that's your second level of risk for any organization. And then the third level of risk is the risk that nonprofits and boards don't often get to in the day-to-day, but is really critical for times like these. And that's what we call generative risk. And those are the fundamental questions to ask yourselves about where and how you exist to serve, leading to judgments about how you move forward in the big picture. So for example, if you've gone to 100% remote work, as we at CNE have, one of the questions you might be asking yourselves is, do we continue to need the same type of physical location moving forward? What, for example, what would happen if we moved to fully mobile services rather than having an in-person office, taking our services out to clients? And another example of a generative question to ask around risk is, should we add an advocacy component to our strategy? Should we work to increase food security overall? Should we work to make sure that childcare is more readily available? Should we work to bridge the digital divide as part of our portfolio of programs in order to effectively achieve not only the Band-Aid or the support system for the organization, but to change the way our systems work so that our services are needed in new and different ways. So those are just examples of the different ways that a board can and should be asking these questions in order to make sure that they're operating looking forward for the organization. The board's role is to see risk in all of these levels and to be grounded in community and experience. So taking risk is really to achieve your mission in the moment. And then next slide. Lastly, here are three questions to consider when you're planning for and trying to mitigate risks. In many cases, this will be a staff or management-led decision-making process, but the board really needs to be ready and willing to serve as a sounding board to the leadership if needed. And they also need to be able to ask good questions to support the staff and the leadership team, weighing the need to resume programming and operations with the need to protect the safety and the well-being of all those who engage with the organization. And so that, for example, could look like looking at state laws and CDC and OSHA requirements. If you're part of a national network or have a statewide network, sourcing resources there. For example, we provide resources at CNE. And then secondly, if you're looking at how to accommodate staff, making sure that you're surveying staff and asking them what their needs are in returning to work, and thinking about flexible remote and in-person work hybrids, and also looking at how to support your staff members who may need to stay home because they are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, or they're taking care of people who are. Other questions to ask in this category are, what's the status of local schools? Because this will impact the ability of people with children to return to work. The availability and safety of public transportation will impact some staff members' ability to return to work, and whether or not to continue travel limitations, even if your staff is back in the office. And then in the third category of, do we understand the legal and liability implications of opening our office? Those are really questions that it's helpful if you have board support around legal advice, insurance agents, professional networks. And we found a tool actually that I hope Andrew will put a link to in the chat box. It's called an adaptive leadership checklist. And I encourage everybody to download that and take a look at that and perhaps share it with the leadership of your organization, because it does a good job of highlighting different areas to focus on in assessing level of risk and what questions to ask and answer for your organizations in deciding how to reopen and how to re-enter working in a physical space. So I'm going to stop there before we hit recovery nuts and bolts and check again to see if there are any questions that have come up.
Nothing so far.
Okay, Cindy, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Christine. So I'm the bookend, which is great. So I launched us off with talking about the framework and what led us to this conversation. I'm wrapping us up talking about the recovery nuts and bolts. And as Christine and I were looking at putting this together, we were also referencing the webinar that we had done just previously on the board's role in crisis. And it was really fascinating to us how some of those trends continued, even as we're looking at getting into this recovery phase. So if we look at the next slide, which is talking about this cultivating resiliency, these are the key things that we're seeing that are still holding true, even in our phase 2, which is this active communication. We need to be leaning into strategy and finance in ways we haven't necessarily before, and that we're ensuring resources. And I'm going to tease these out individually. So let me tease out a little bit more around active communication. The very first thing you'll see there is transparency is essential. That's good governance regardless of the time, but certainly now even more so. We need to be sure that we're engaging our closest allies and that we're remembering the why. Remembering the why is why your organization exists. So let me tease this out a little bit more. So just to be mindful that if you're a public-facing organization where you're actively engaged with the public, that you're already into that space of being really clear and transparent about the protocols and you're communicating those around keeping the public safe. We can't stress enough the importance of communication between your staff, your board, and your volunteers. And that's particularly transparent right now, letting them know what the immediate plans are in terms of re-engagement and giving sufficient notice so that they can make arrangements. As Christine said, school's not in session, childcare may be a question. There are things they may need to get in place before they can transition back into work. And then also that we're letting our stakeholders know, our donors and our clients and our community, about how the COVID situation is affecting our organization, what it is that we're doing in a way that we're addressing it, that we're remembering the needs of those that we are serving, and also knowing that those needs may have changed during this time. Just as your organization has shifted, those that you are serving may shift. And so you need to create an opportunity to get some feedback from them so you also know how you need to be pivoting and changing the work and the ways that you may be doing and executing on your strategy and your work. So if you slip to the next one, where we're talking about leaning into strategy and finance, real-time scenario planning. This was a big part of when we were talking about the board's role in crisis. Scenario planning, certainly in terms of programming, but particularly around finance. Be sure that your board has a handle on your cash flow and that you're building out your financial scenario planning in the context of your assumptions. So all of us coming into this built a budget, assuming that we'd be able to meet face-to-face. At a minimum, all of us had that assumption. That no longer holds true right now. And so we need to be pivoting our financial trajectories on what we know now. And so building assumptions, and some people are doing it like a best case scenario, worst case scenario, whatever makes sense to you, that you're building in different assumptions and saying, if this happens, this will be the impact on our budget. And it's based on these assumptions. If this assumption holds true, this will have an impact. Want to be sure that you're keeping your financial scenario planning current. We also need to be sure that you're reimagining the future. Remember, I said we're not going to be returning to February 2020. We don't know where we're headed, but we know it's going to be different. And so we want to be sure that you are making the priorities that you need to be reimagining that future, whether that's forming a strategy committee, as Christine mentioned, that's engaging stakeholders and board and staff, that you're getting new ideas flowing. You may be raising money in a different way. I know I'm working with lots of organizations who had planned spring fundraisers that didn't happen. They're deciding whether they're going to delay them into the fall or if they're going to do something virtually. We also encourage you to be thinking both short-term and long-term around goals. In general, when we're talking about strategy with organizations, we're encouraging them to be looking at about 3 months at a time. In general, we're able to predict in rough, broad terms about 3 months, but even that 3-month plan needs to have a lot of versatility to it. So being sure that you have that group, that strategy committee, or another entity that's helping you to be putting those 3-month plans in place, at the same time being mindful of what your long-term goal is, which is to sustain your organization and be there in that rebuilding phase that we'll be reaching in the 3rd phase. And then the last piece around this cultivating resiliency is really ensuring that we have resources. And you'll see the first bullet on this slide is where we're really highlighting the staff, that your staff is doing hard work on the ground, they're iterating things in real time for your organization, especially in March when this first began. Being sure as a board member that you're checking in with them, asking what they need, ask how you can support them. If you're an organization that encourages board participation philanthropically, we're encouraging board members to give now to help to build up some of that stability in the giving. And also mentioning, as I said a little while ago, about adapting your fundraising approaches, that needs to look different. And at this point, we're actually encouraging you to reach out to your donors that you know and actually get their thoughts. Empathize first with them, what's happening. Connect with them around what you're doing through your communications. Ask where they are in terms of their philanthropic interest, and see if there's an alignment still with your organization and where they're wanting to go. The biggest piece around this is just being sure that you're asking and you're listening, being mindful of what the needs are, how that's shifting, whether it's internal or external, and you're building some strategy around those pieces. And then the last slide, I'm just talking about kind of our 5 key takeaways. I've mentioned before, we're not going back to February 2020. Christine really gave some concrete examples of how to go about building your risk leadership muscle. We need to be sure the board is taking action. This is not a time for inaction. It wasn't that in the first phase. It's definitely not in the second phase. Being mindful that your role right now is to transition your organization into something new. We need that innovation, entrepreneurship needs to be present right now. And at the same time that you're cultivating that resiliency, those skills and plans that you needed in crisis, you also need that at this time as well in phase 2. So those are some of the key takeaways, but we want to be sure we're opening up to questions because we're hoping we've provided some very thought-provoking things for you to think about, and we want to engage you in some conversation around that. So Andrew, I'm going to pass that to you.
Thanks, Cindy. There we go. I'm just going to pull this up so we can all see each other a little bit better. And I think that if folks have questions, they should feel free to unmute themselves and jump in and ask Cindy and Christine what they want to know.
So,
Hi, Barbara.
hey, of course, I have a question. So in listening to all of this, one of the 2 other elements of the board's work that I think we need to make sure that doesn't get lost in all the reaction is our ability to make sure that we're still adhering to the mission, as well as if we have a strategic plan, do our actions align in response to this and the pivoting? Do they align with the strategic plan, or does the strategic direction of the organization need to change as well? So those were the 2 things I was thinking about as listening to all of this.
Barbara, I think you raise a good point around, are we in alignment with our mission? Because one of the really challenging parts, I think, for many of our organizations who aren't on the front lines is figuring out how to be responsive to the clients and customers they have in a remote or less physical environment, and also figuring out how to provide services in a completely new way. And so there's I think a real temptation during a time like this to innovate and create new types of programs and services. And the question is whether those are focused in on the mission that you have. Can they be articulated as mission driven or mission focused? And if not, maybe those aren't the programs or services that you should be providing, but it's okay to take the time, and this gets to your second point, to step back and look at your strategy, if you have one, and if you don't have one, to decide to put one together, and to look at what your strategy has been telling you about the types of programs that you're offering in the community, and to decide whether or not that strategy needs to be shifted. And so that question is, we've all done strategic planning work that can take 6 months to a year, and we don't have 6 months to a year, and we don't have the information that we would need to plan for 6 months to a year. And so one of the things that we're looking at and advising our nonprofits around, and C&E actually is doing this work, is we're calling them strategy shorts or strategy bursts, or strategy triage, frankly, where we're looking at what of our programs still are relevant in the current environment, and what of our programs do we want to stand down, put to the side, pause, and maybe honor and let go, given what we know we expect the next couple years of unrest to be. And that is strategy work, even if it doesn't look like a traditional strategic planning process. The key here, though, is to not do it in the abstract, to not do it without being deeply connected to what the needs are of your customers and your clients. And there are different ways to gather and understand that need. But we of course never do strategy without really looking at who are the people that we're working with and wanting to serve. But the real issue here is you cannot plan more than a quarter out. And if you're trying to do planning beyond a quarter out, that is, I think, would probably make all of us pull our hair out and really have deep frustration. So encourage everybody to do strategic thinking and to plan strategically, but do it in shorter bursts, shorter sprints, and do it in a way that really is reflective of what the community need is that you can identify, and understanding that we're going to have to pilot and we're going to have to adjust more in real time than we have in current memory. So
And
thanks for that comment.
And Christine, I would also add, because one of the things that's very apparent, if we're going to continue, based on the comment as far as discovering inequities, the whole technology infrastructure, there's some part of it is, can you really still hold true to your mission and your strategic direction about inclusivity and equity if technology ends up being the mode in which you deliver your programs and services and that's inequitable? So, do you end up getting connected with other organizations to achieve to work on an issue that is important for your particular organization to be able to do and share what they do? I hope that makes sense.
It makes sense, and that gets to my point in the part of the presentation about it may be that you want to be looking at a question of if technology is really going to be critical to you achieving your mission, and there's an inequitable ability to access technology, then first and foremost, we have to work on that. We have to work on closing the digital divide in order to make sure that if your mission is still relevant, you can achieve it in a different, more non-physical environment.
There's another question here in the chat box, and it's asking about the role of the board and the staff, and really in the details of like who comes up with that transition plan. Is it the board, is it the staff, and what's the board's role in terms of approving it or vetting it?
Cindy, do you want to jump on that one?
Sure. Sure, I'd be happy to. So what I'm seeing with organizations is actually a combination of both, because of course we need the board being there, as Christine was talking about, in terms of risk, but we also have our staff that are at different places in terms of their situation of whether childcare is a concern, where they're feeling about personal safety, where they are in terms of taking care of others. So what we are seeing, in my experience as I'm working with organizations, it actually is a combination of a small group of both board members and staff who are working together to craft. And we do have tools at CNE that have questionnaires that will help as you're looking at your staff and getting some questions out to them around their comfort level, what their expectations are, what they need. So we're happy to send that. And I'll make a note, Andrew, that we do that in a follow-up email as a tool that can help to inform this small group that might be looking at that work. And Christine, you may have some additional things to add.
I think you covered it, Cindy. If you haven't yet created a COVID-19 kind of board staff task force, that may be a way that you can tackle this using everybody's best information. Or if you're an organization that has a variety of staff members, it could be that you ask the staff to develop the reopening plan, and then you engage the board in asking kind of strategic questions around that plan to make sure you've taken the 360 view of all of the different issues that could come into play. So I will go back to our touchstone that the board is an asset if you make it so, and if you recognize that there's both a governing and a managing role. And at this point, at this time, all hands on deck is really a valuable approach to the work.
Did you have something else you wanted to add, Barbara? Are there other questions?
So I don't know if folks out there would be willing to share, but I'm interested in knowing where you are in putting together your thinking around a reopening plan, and what are the key stumbling blocks for you, because that is helpful to us in providing advice and counsel, and then also sourcing resources that can be valuable to you. So if anybody's willing to share that, we would love to hear that from you.
I'm Ellen Boughton, and I'm from the North Branch School Board of Directors. North Branch is a small independent school, nursery through 8th grade in Nelson County. Our chief stumbling block is we don't know what the governor is going to say about schools. So we're trying to make plan A, plan B, you know, will it, if the governor says, okay, schools will open, he says on June 10th, schools will open. We plan for school opening. There's a big surge in, I don't know, August, say, and then schools close again. So, you know, what plans do we make? And we have a very active board that works very closely with the staff. And so we're all kind of working together and trying to come up with scenarios for whatever may happen. But this is, you know, what we do is constrained by what the rules are going to be.
Well, Ellen, you raise a really important point that it is all about scenario planning, and you can't do 196 scenario plans, right? None of us could do that, but you have to take the information that you have right now, look at what 3 scenario plans potentially are, and then try to line up your resources and assets to be able to support those plans depending on what happens. And that's helpful if you already have a board engaged with your staff in doing that, because if you just look at the note that just came out from the University of Virginia, they basically said, we're planning on reopening, and we still have all kinds of questions that we're debating and discussing. So the University of Virginia has considerable resources and is still finding it a challenge. So we hear you and understand the challenge.
All in that same boat, you know, of not knowing what's coming. We, fortunately for Love Inc., great majority of the work that we do is either on computer or by telephone. So we've been pretty successful just working out of our homes. So we're not in a real hurry, but at the same time, there are things that you've got to do in an office. So we're in the process of just looking at it both from the staff standpoint and the board standpoint.
Christine, I really appreciate that you said that we are not going back to February 2020. And when you said that, it really struck me, because I think a lot of people are saying, well, we're just going to get back to where we were before, and we're just going to pick up and go forward. But we're not. And the more that we think about this in that way of that framework, I think that will push us forward. So I really appreciate today's discussion, because it's really making me make that firm in my head too. Thank you.
Thanks, Beverly. And I think that also that can help us focus less on what we've lost and more on what our new opportunities are. And the more time we as board members and we as organizations are focused on the future and new opportunities, the more likely we are to be able to survive the transition and thrive into recovery. And I frankly think that given what we've seen in terms of the inequities in the pandemic, that we have deep opportunities to engage our nonprofit sector and our local, state, and national government about how to do things differently. And I don't want to lose that opportunity with all of us focused on going back to the way it was. So I would like us all to keep an open mind about what new opportunities are out there that can achieve what we've all wanted to achieve in our nonprofit work, which is more equity so that all of our community members can thrive
Can we hear from Stu, and then I think maybe Charlie had something to add?
Great.
Yeah, Charlie's my boss. We're going to let him go first.
Okay.
There we go. I got to unmute myself. Your presentation, I think, reconfirms a lot of the work we've done.
Good.
And, you know, we focused on financing, we got loans, we shut down our used clothing and furniture store immediately, and now we're working on plans to reopen it because it is an income producing aspect of our community center. And I think we are doing it in a very deliberate and safe way. The challenge that you presented today about leading into something new is really thought-provoking, and it's got me thinking, what can we do new, and how can we change sort of the direction of the community center and engage more people. The other thing I'm thinking about is the fundraising. We used to, in February, we were planning all these summer events, fundraising events, and now that's gone by the wayside. How do we raise money and not gather people together? Stu, do you want to add something to that?
Just a couple of things. Yeah, echoing what Charlie said about us transitioning now back to reopening parts of our center. We need to do that not only because it's a financial resource for us, but it's a vital community resource. Our thrift store, and we're going to do it in baby steps. We're going to do it as safely as we possibly can, but we're very aware that there are going to be challenges, one of which is meeting all of the regulations and guidelines and suggestions of the Virginia Department of Health, the governor, OSHA, our insurance companies, et cetera, who are all weighing in on how we can protect our staff, our volunteers, and the public. We're working through that, and we've decided to err on the side of caution and an abundance of caution, and we'll keep you posted on how that all goes. As far as the fundraising goes and other programming changes, we're a membership nonprofit. So we need to look first, in my view, to our immediate community, which is our membership, all 600 of those people, but also our greater community, which is Nelson County, to listen to what they say the needs are. And we're very fortunate that we've just completed a survey of our constituents that will help guide us in that. Our ability to respond to those in a time when we're very constricted financially, and that when we have limited resources to go out into the community, we're going to find a way to do that. And creative work from the board in support of staff is going to be very important for that.
Good going. Yep.
Cindy, I don't know if you want to jump in on the kind of how do we raise money without doing it in person piece of the equation. And I'm sure other people have thought about this as well, but.
Sure, I can share some of the things that I'm seeing with organizations. One of the most successful, actually I've seen it with numerous organizations who already had planned an event, is that they've reached out to their invitee list and to their sponsors and explained the situation and asked if they would still consider giving. And I know of 3 organizations that actually surpassed their goal that they had set for the event by doing that. So that's been an interesting twist. So they've done nothing other than to say, because of the current situation, 2 of them were galas. They didn't think it was appropriate to be throwing a party at this time. So they provided in the context of their organization why they felt that wasn't appropriate. And one was a golf tournament. And both of those have turned out successful. So I'm seeing that. I'm also seeing organizations that are doing some really creative things online where they're bringing donors together and they're highlighting stories. So if they have a client that they're working with They bring everyone together at a set time. And then they're having a presentation where that individual, in this particular case, it was an organization that worked with high school students. And so they had the high school student come and share the story in a Zoom format with that. I have another organization that's looking at doing something similar, but they're partnering with a local business, a local restaurant, so that the donors actually go to the restaurant, pick up the meals, then they all are having dinner together around a Zoom meeting with the presentation there. So again, there's some really creative things that's happening. But again, also the unevent has been successful also.
Let's do lunch. My place or yours? Both.
Well, and my 2 cents would be on, from a community center standpoint, from a membership standpoint, from a who we've served standpoint. I think now is the time to be grounded in how we did it before, but not be constrained by that. And so I think there's what I've seen is a real opening and opportunity for everybody to think differently about how to work together moving forward, and that it's a real opportunity to provide new programs and services that can perhaps bring different types of people into your work, whether you're RVCC, the Community Center at Nelson, and also to think about the people and the communities that you haven't yet engaged, and to ask why. You know, why haven't we yet engaged these folks, and what are some new opportunities to do that in ways that could be in service to them? And then the final thing I'll say is, from a membership standpoint, I just think it's really important to be open and transparent about understanding that if you are a membership organization and take in paid dues, that different organizations and individuals will be experiencing different levels of financial crisis. And so being proactive about giving different opportunities for people to continue to stay engaged, but either paying on a longer time schedule, or delaying the payments, or getting some time where you're not having to pay in order to stay involved in the mission, even if you don't have the finances to do what you ordinarily would do. And that's not just membership. I think that's in the arts and culture setting as well. Making sure that people are staying involved in the mission in some way, so that they can continue to feel like it's part of their world when they move through into recovery. And people will do that in different stages.
Christine, Andrew, and Cindy, I just wanted to share what Live Arts is doing. This coming season will be the 30th birthday or 30th year of the organization's existence. And so in this downtime, that's why I'm just going to use that word. I mean, we obviously shuttered 2.5 shows and working on what does summer camps look like in the summer show. And I think that's all going to be either concert or online. But the artistic director pulled together a review of the 29 prior seasons. And so each night in May, he's pulled in people from that year, you know, whether it's just one person that was in multiple shows, or a founder, or the director, artistic director at that time, and whether they have readings, or some of the actors come back on for one particular show, but they talk about that particular year. And we initially, the thought behind that was really just to showcase and give a history of the organization over the last 29 years. But it's turned into a fundraiser, because people started, you know, putting challenge grant, you know, I'll put up 10,000 and I'll match 10K, the first 10,000 or something like that. So what has turned into a great archive of the history of the organization, it's re-engaged past artists or volunteers of the organization. We've been able to collect that history, plus it's helped us generate revenue. So Deborah or Beverly, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that. So.
Barbara, I think you've given a kind of a great closing example of the idea that there are two sides of the coin on risk, right? One is to protect your operations and your finances so you can continue to stay alive. And the other is, this is the time to lean into the risk of doing things differently and being open to what potentially can happen as a result of that. So you didn't anticipate it would be a fundraiser. You just wanted to continue to keep people engaged. And so encourage everybody still on the line to lean into that part of the risk that allows you to achieve your mission and be open to thinking about doing it completely differently, and that there's real opportunity there. It's hard, but we're all in a hard position right now. And so that's the job, that's the unique asset of the board. And so good luck going out and finding those opportunities. And thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We are happy to follow up with any of you all with virtual office hours where we can talk individually about the challenges that you're facing. You will notice that we will continue to do these kinds of programs online unless and until we're back in person. And we want you to consider this to be the middle of a conversation, and we look forward to more conversations. Andrew, do you have anything else to say to close us up?
Yeah, I have a couple of things. One is I just put a link to the evaluation form, if you don't mind taking a minute to fill that out. And while you're looking at that, I'll just mention a couple of other upcoming trainings. The one that's sort of the most relevant, I think, is on Monday, and it's a panel discussion around reopening and reentry from the sort of operations, human resources management perspective. So the EDs in the room here, managing boards or folks who want to pass this on to their staff. That should be an important conversation. We're going to have an operations consultant, an HR expert, and someone who specializes in liability insurance, talking about those sort of very practical, hands-on aspects of bringing people back into a safe working environment and a safe place for clients and other constituents to be. The other thing I'll mention is that we did, I'm not sure how many of you were there, but Christine and Cindy had done an earlier session on the board's role in crisis. And in the follow-up to this, I'll include the video for that as well, in case you want to go back and take a look at that piece as well. And again, in that follow-up email, I'll include a couple of the resources we mentioned here. I'll include a video recording of this presentation and the slide deck in case you want to share that with other folks on the board. That's all everyone. I have, so thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cindy and Christine, and thanks everyone for coming.
Great to see you. Good luck out there.